In my experience, making a good swatch is probably the most important thing in knitting. It will save time, yarn, nerves, and it makes my work much more fun and pleasure and improves my results. There is also a saying, if you don't know what to knit the swatches. And I think it's for a good reason, because you will be able to see what the yarn can do and get inspired. I generally make 4 kinds of swatches. The very small ones, to just try out the yarn, to see what kind of design I like: stockinette, rib, garter stitch, cable, or do I like single-stranded or double-stranded. So these swatches can be very small and they are very temporary. The second kind is, I call it inspirational. Once I like the fabric I'm getting, it can be a very small swatch, but I will make very detailed notes and I will keep them. And I return to the swatches because sometimes if I don't have any idea what I like to knit, I simply go through the swatches and see what yarn I used, what was the needle size, what techniques I used for casting on, binding off, how the edges behaved, were they rolling up or they were holding flat. It also helps to see how the rib behaves. For example, in this swatch, the rib is non-elastic, it doesn't bounce, and I really like it. So this is just some information about binding off. I use different needle sizes for the stockinette stitch and for the rib. So once I know what I like to knit, I make preparatory swatches. They are much larger and I keep very detailed notes. And these swatches I wash using the same method of washing as what I'm going to use for my actual garment. You can see some of the notes. I write down what yarn I used, what was the fiber, the weight of the yarn, the color, even the lot number, the needle size, and the bind off method, and even a spelling mistake. These swatches are much larger than the previous kind because I do have to measure how many stitches and rows I have in 10 centimeters or 4 inches, so they are generally much larger than 10 centimeters. And now I have this another category. These are the swatches for knitting in the round. They are made using a different technique that I will show a little bit later in this video. I make them as large as I can again. So this one is, for example, much wider than 10 centimeters because I really wanted to be as precise as possible with the gauge. And I made detailed notes about my yarn, the intended use, what needles I used, and especially how I washed it and how I dried it. And on this side you can see that I dried it in a dryer and the gauge was very different. Drying flat and drying in a dryer produced 2 completely different looks and a different gauge. And this is another swatch I made using the same yarn. but single-stranded, because I wanted to compare how the fabric will look, which way I like better. Again, it's a very large sample, and I already planned how I'm going to bind off and made very detailed notes about the gauge, for example, before washing and after washing, and you can see it changed a little bit. So as you have probably noticed, the swatches for knitting in the round are made differently than the swatches for knitting flat. And the reason is that when we knit in the round in stockinette stitch, we only work the knit stitches, versus when we knit flat or back and forth, we make one row of the knit stitches and then turn our work around and work the purl stitches. And in the continental knitting, I find that the purl stitches are just a tiny bit taller than the knit stitches. And that creates a small difference in the gauge, in the amount of the rows that we get per 10 centimeters or 4 inches. So to make the calculations more accurate, I prefer to create a true sample for the circular knitting, when I only work the knit stitches. So to make my calculations as precise as possible, I create an imitation of circular knitting without the circular knitting, because honestly I don't want to knit a very large swatch all the way around. It's just too much work. So I'll show you how you can cheat this sort of by only doing half of the circular knitting and getting an accurate gauge for the circular knitting. And I know the two ways of doing this. One is a true imitation of the circular knitting, and the other one is sort of a trick that you can use also. And I'll show you both methods in this video. I finished my cast on row. This is a long tail cast on. And instead of turning my work around to continue working in the opposite direction, I will pull my needle out all the way. And now I can continue working in the same direction from right to left. Next, I will measure the length of my working yarn. I am measuring 4 lengths of my cast on row. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I have my working yarn in the amount of 4 lengths of my cast on row. Now I take the right needle tip and bring the working yarn closer to the first stitch on the right side of the cast on row, leaving the loop of the working yarn behind the work, like this. And I will knit the row as usual from right to left. I'm making this sample in stockinette stitch, but it can be done in any other pattern that your design calls for, including lace and cable, whatever you like. Just tighten a little bit the first stitch. And I'll go all the way to the last stitch. I finished the first row up to the cast on row in this direction. And instead of continuing knitting in the opposite direction, I pull the needle out again and move my work all the way to the right, like this. And tighten the edges a little bit. And now I will continue knitting from right to left again. Now I'm going to leave the same amount of working yarn behind by simply holding it together with the first loop. So I leave behind the same length of the working yarn as for the first row. And I can continue again knitting from right to left. I work my stitches from right to left again. And the edges are going to look a bit loose, so as I go along, I tighten them a little bit. And now I have two loops of the working yarn behind, and each loop represents a part of the circular row that I didn't need. As I go along, the edges look a little bit loose, so I simply tighten them by pulling my yarn like this. So it keeps the edges neat. And on the other side also, I pull each end and the sides look more accurate. Again, after finishing a row, I pull my needle all the way out and move the work to the right side. And now measure the length of yarn for the loop, like this. And again, I'm ready to continue working from right to left. I hold together the new working yarn and the working yarn from the previous row for neater edge stitches and continue knitting from right to left. So every time, instead of knitting all the way in the round, we're just leaving a little bit of the working yarn behind. And this saves a lot of time and a lot of work. And now you can ask me a question: why do I need to leave 4 lengths of the cast on row if my actual row is so short? First of all, because the long tail cast on row can stretch a little. So I'll show you in a moment. This is how it may look. It's a little longer than right after casting on. And if the loops are too short, like, let me show you, like this for example, then it can constrict the work and interfere with washing and drying, so you would have difficulty, for example, laying it flat and measuring the gauge. So it's better always to leave longer loops. Like in this example, it's very easy to lay it flat, to dry, smoothen it out, and measure the gauge. Here I have 1 gauge after drying the swatch flat, and then I decided to dry it in a dryer. So what I do, I take some cotton thread and tie the loops so they don't tangle in the dryer. And the other half as well. And put them in a washing bag. And this is the result after I took it out of the dryer. It actually feels much softer and nicer, and I like the look. I like it better than when the swatch dried flat. And the gauge now is a little bit different. I think it's very important to use the exact same method of washing and drying. You will get much more accurate measurements. And I write down all the important information on a small piece of scrap paper and attach it to my swatch. As I mentioned earlier in this video, the purl stitches are slightly taller than the knit stitches. That's why a swatch worked back and forth will not be very accurate for an item that is going to be worked in the round. So you can use this trick and work all the knit stitches with a larger needle size, and then when you turn your work around, work the purl stitches with a smaller needle, and this will imitate knitting in the round. This trick is also very helpful to even out the appearance of the stitches in an item where most of it was worked in the round, but for example a pocket is worked back and forth. It's a good idea that a swatch includes the edges, the trim, and all other decorative elements, including the buttonholes if you are going to use buttons, so there are no surprises later. And it's good to have the buttons ready so you can try them on and to see that they fit into the buttonhole and they are of the right style or color, so you can make any corrections and make sure that your knitting turns out beautiful and brings you joy.